to anything this planet has ever seen, except when the government, the government would come in and smash things up and hide them. We're developing stuff all over the world simultaneously as we do this show, and we're bringing all this stuff out. I'm writing another book now called The Inside Track that'll be out next spring. It'll be more along the hologram. The one you've got now deals up to scalar waves and some of those space-time singularity things you were wanting to talk about.
Right.
I'm taking this a whole other level, and that's also why I'm in the film industry, because we're working on some documentaries right now to bring all this out. And people are going to say, well, these guys came out of nowhere, but not really. We've been doing the Art Bell Show for 7 or 8 years.
Of course,
We've been talking to Ian on it, and he knew all about it. Where were you?
Well, I look forward to being able to say that someday.
Yeah.
Now, let me ask you, though, about the Department of Defense thing. This is something that comes up a lot on Coast to Coast, because there's kind of a counterintuitive, or at least it's, I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but it's at least simultaneously, it seems like a guest will be speaking about the government, the difficulties of the government, and at the same time working with it, or talking about peace and working toward raising global consciousness, and then also helping the Department of Defense. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, the way I reconciled it, sometimes I was considered a rogue, and sometimes I was considered a benefit. Years ago, when you see some of the stuff on there, I was involved in a big dispute, and that's all posted, by the way. It's all documented about, Roger Chaffee and White and Grissom died on the Cape down there.
Right.
The Apollo 1. When that happened, I was involved in that. I tried to stop that before it happened. We had 1,407 tests, wiring problems we found on that bird after it blew up. And so I got into a big controversy. But what I did at that time, you'll see all the electronic news articles and magazines that I was in back in those days, because I was always high profile. You have to build a profile around yourself to protect yourself. And I've always done that. I always make sure that millions of people know who I am and what I'm doing, and I've been doing that most of my life. So you have to develop a profile so that gives you some kind of a sanction.
Yeah.
The second thing is you've got to know stuff. I mean, obviously when I went out and visited 3,000 companies, which is also documented on that website, I had to know something, and I had to be of some sort of a benefit.
Sure.
And
sure.
And I was, and I because I had training in quantitative and qualitative measurements, and anybody that's doing any kind of an experiment, whether it be biofeedback, whether it be a strain gauge on a wing test in a wind tunnel, or whether it be a lunar landing experiment in a cryogenic chamber, I was there. I was your person, and I did that kind of stuff. And I documented it. I kept all my documents.
Well, I get that. I guess what I'm saying is maybe morally then, maybe I'll be more specific, that it seems like you're talking about peace in one sense and raising global consciousness and advancing, a kind of a planetary responsibility for what's happening in the world and how our government can sometimes not be working in our best interest, and then also working for the Department of Defense.
Okay, well, here's another example. Let's just say I have friends in intelligence. Okay. When George Tenet fell on his sword for Bush, right?
Right.
A lot of really good people that I knew left the intelligence community. They left. And these are people that had experience with extraterrestrials. Some of them, they would consult with me after they had the experience. These people had families like we do, and they were concerned. There's a human factor in intelligence, just like there is outside of it. But when political aversion and corruption get so great, then there's mass exoduses, and that's what happened then. Up until that point, I was doing quite a bit of work with what I thought people that were involved in the government, and they had good heart chakra, good heart root causes. That's the kind of people I work with. Back a long time ago in the 60s when I worked in them, and back in the 50s when I was first indoctrinated as a kid, I didn't know so much about good and bad and who was right and who was wrong, and I don't think because the Cold War was going on it really mattered that much. But as time went on and I saw these cover-ups, it really got to me. But on the same hand, I became a well-known Pleiadian contactee, and I brought some amazing science out, and some of that's posted up on another website. Some of it's on my website. And so some of the inventions that I had come up with and some of the designs that I used were beyond, you just couldn't say there wasn't something to this. So that gave me credibility. And in the old days of exchange, there'd be 50% BS and there'd be 50%, stuff. They want to know what about contact. I'd say so-and-so site, this installation is going to be visited by ETs and blah, blah, blah. And they'd be there. And that would kind of stir them up,
Have they ever had any direct contact that you know of?
The government?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, where...
Yeah, lots and lots and lots of it.
Sit down, interview,
running a tape recorder, kind of.
So they don't. Well, yeah, but they aren't going to release any of that kind of stuff. This started back with Roswell. That Roswell crash, I've got that documented on there was the radar that I was working on. I was developing the Alamogordo Valley in not White Sands, but up in Santa Fe in that area that brought those ships down. I got that on the website, and that was those first crashes they had. The first one was 1951. Dr. Mendoza from Johns Hopkins University was interrogating one of the three survivors of Roswell, and they that's where the term extraterrestrial biological entity (EB) was coined. I mean, you can go back to there if you want to start getting reference material, and then we can come forward. One of my friends was at Wright-Patterson back in mid '80s, and they had underground at Wright-Pat in Dayton, Ohio. There was 3 different groups of aliens there working. And then when my friend Margaret Habsburg of the Habsburg fame of Europe, her husband was working with 4 Greys out at Sandia Labs when she lived out there with a friend of mine, Sir Anthony James, who was knighted by the Queen of England, who was one of my best friends. They were working with Greys. That's the Theta Reticulans.
Working with them meaning what? I mean, like going in, punching a clock.
Systems and weapon systems.
And they would just be there like anybody else.
Yeah, when Margaret's husband died, realized Margaret Habsburg owns 60% of Europe. There's the Habsburgs, the Bilderbergers, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. These are the richest families in the world. They're trillionaires. And she was scared to death, because her husband was working on this stuff. They had the NSA as their guards, and they had a 40-acre compound inside the Sandia Labs, proving grounds, and that's where they lived. And they did all these experiments over there. This goes on. Also, we got a lot of stuff going underground. I don't know if you noticed, they're closing all the surface spaces now, and everybody's going underground because of the problem with the atmosphere.
Well, all right. Yeah. I want to hear more about that, too. But yeah. I back up. It's a really mundane question. But when working with these EVs or working
extraterrestrial biological entities,
right? Working with them on a day-to-day basis. You mean they have like a dorm for them? Do they have houses?
Yeah, they have facilities for them. Of course they do. Yeah.
And are they human-like facilities? Are they more like what they experienced on their home planet?
They're environmentally comfortable for the different people that they work with.
So
and most of them are underground for obvious reasons. They don't want to be detected by satellite from space.
So atmosphere? I mean, what would they just with regular oxygen?
In our atmosphere, some of them, this reptilian thing that they had that I never saw, but one of my friends saw it in intelligence. He said he had to wear a suit all the time. He had some kind of a methane suit that he wore. He had to have the addition of methane, to breathe. He couldn't breathe oxygen. It didn't work too well for him.
All right. So
I never met him, but this is just hearsay. Most I'm familiar with is the Greys and a few of the Nordic types, the Pleiadian types.
Okay. Did they wear clothes?
Yeah. They wear loose-fitting clothes.
Like of their own type, or did they adapt to laboratory wear?
No. They wore their own clothes.
Okay.
They're just skin-tight little things like, what do you call that stuff that people on bicycles all over the place ride?
Right.
Yeah, that kind of stuff mostly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then did they speak English then, or did they communicate telepathically? Or
I had one experience with one Grey. His name was Gokti Lokti. And the Greys speak. I mean, if you imagine making this, how we talk when we exhale, we have a tendency to speak. If you try to inhale and speak, you'll make these funny sounds. That's kind of what they do. They have a very high frequency pitched sound that they make when they communicate. But normally they commute telepathically quite well. They can project thoughts right into your brain, and that's been my experience. That's pretty much how they work. The Pleiadians, when they don't work with the government because they don't like the government. But they have been captured by the government, and they can speak English. They speak several languages. They can adapt to a language. The Pleiadian language is more like Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is a Tibetan language. It was brought here 26,000 years ago by what's called the Rishis and the Vedas, and the Rishis came from the Pleiades. So their language is based on phonic sounds of nature like water, running, wind blowing, and those kinds of things. So the languages vary depending on the species. The Greys are considered a 6 billion-year-old evolved insect in the fact that they don't have a soul like we do. They have group hive consciousness. So they have an insect type communication, but it is telepathic. It's a little bit painful for some people.
What do you mean?
Well, I had a couple of experiences with them as a contactee and with a Grey directly. it was just uncomfortable for me. I really didn't get into it. I like Pleiadians much better.
Well, I'm fascinated by that. So can I ask you, just when we come back, to explain why that was painful?